Today, I am proud to announce the Walt Disney Company is acquiring Lucasfilm, the global entertainment company founded by George Lucas and the home of the legendary Star Wars franchise.
In my last video, I talked about what's actually going wrong with Star Wars. And I made a lot of videos that are like this, but this last video, I really wanted to boil down, if you could, down to 3 things that are really wrong with Star Wars today. And that's that the people that are making it, they don't believe in male heroes, they don't believe in redemption, and they don't believe, most importantly, in an objective good and an objective evil, a good and evil that runs across the board. It is not subjective, it is not subjective to the whims of political leaders, that it is good and evil no matter what. And they don't believe in that, right? This moral relativism seems to just be poisoning the world. And I said that that was really what was going on. And Dave Filoni was the last straw. He was like this last hope that we had that Disney was going to make something that was close to what George Lucas originally envisioned for Star Wars. And I got a lot of interesting comments. Some of them not so nice. It's a good thing I'm thick-skinned. And some of them that make really, really good points. And one of them I want to talk about today, I got it from Chase Hedges 6775. He says, the prequel trilogy hate back in 1999 and modern Disney buying it, that's what's ruined Star Wars. And this is a wonderful point. I agree with it from a more mechanical and tangible point of view. I do think that what I said before, those core beliefs, that's a problem, and these people are going to make terrible movies, they're going to make terrible shows, irrespective of them being part of the Star Wars lore. They're going to be bad because of their beliefs. But this is really an interesting point from a more mechanical point of view. Back in 1999, when the prequel trilogy hit, Jar Jar hit, people hated it. I mean, they really did. Now, if you're around the age of 30 or younger, you probably don't understand hating the prequel trilogy because of that. But for older millennials like myself, and especially for Gen Xers that love Star Wars, when Jar Jar hit the screen, so many of them were done. They were out. And when Attack of the Clones hit, the rest of them were out. Attack of the Clones is not a terrible movie. It's not a bad movie. I love it because George Lucas makes great Star Wars movies. But as far as filmmaking is concerned, it's not that great of a film. I don't think we can really get around that. I still love it. It still fits great in the Star Wars lore. I love it. It is not comparable to great films in the way that Empire Strikes Back is, or in the way that Return of the Jedi is. Even in the way that, especially from a cinematic point of view, the original Star Wars is one of the greatest films ever made. You cannot say the same thing about Attack of the Clones. I mean, you just cannot. And there is a really good argument to be made that they really weren't that great. I don't agree with it. I love the prequel trilogy, but so many people had left it at that moment. And this comment that came from Chase Hedges, I think that it depends on 2 assumptions in order for it to be true. The first assumption, which is the most obvious one, is that if George Lucas kept Star Wars and that he made the sequel trilogy, that it would be better than what Disney has made. And the second assumption is you use the word modern Disney, and this would suggest that older Disney would have made better Star Wars, that there was a time when older Disney was making good movies, making good shows. I think this is very true. And I want to start with that point before we get to George Lucas. I think this is a very interesting thing. There was a time, there's been multiple golden ages of Disney. And the Disney that made Snow White, the Disney that made Cinderella, the Disney that made Sleeping Beauty, that Disney was really good at telling stories. That Disney was really good at putting those stories on screen. And yes, they were animating, but it's still a story. That Disney is the same Disney that made, Robin Hood, the same Disney that made Sword in the Stone, one of my favorite movies ever. And that Disney did an amazing job. And then the second golden age of Disney, I believe they did an amazing job starting with The Little Mermaid. They were telling great stories. And for almost 10 years, maybe minus Mulan, I've never understood why people like that movie. Or Pocahontas. The messaging is just so in your face, I can't stand it. But The Lion King is the best Disney movie ever made. And by the way, in the comments, please tell me what you think the best Disney movie ever made is. Mine is The Lion King. I think it is absolutely perfect. It is such a great film. That particular Disney did an amazing job, and Pixar in the mid-90s was doing such a great job telling these stories that I think that if that Disney had gotten a hold of Star Wars, they probably would have made a really great series, or at least it would have been closer to what it is that the fans want. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Star Wars fans, but I'm not going to pretend for a second that we are not a volatile group of people.
Han Solo's a bitch.
Oh, no. No,
I'm sorry, what did you just say?
right? And again, I don't blame fans for anything. If we are this way, it's because, first off, we're very passionate about the things that we love, especially when it comes to Star Wars. For a lot of us, Star Wars is a pretty big deal. And also because there has been a lot of changes. There have been a lot of things that we hold dear that have been ruined by one person or another. And that obviously has changed the way that people interact with one another when it comes to Star Wars. And then when you add into that social media, people just say whatever the heck they want, knowing there's zero consequences. Obviously, there's a lot of volatility. There's kind of a lot of poison inside the Star Wars community. And it's to no fault of the fans, right? This is something that has happened organically as a result, especially of Disney, but even of the prequel trilogy. This is just something that's happened amongst the masses. So having said that, I think that even if a golden age Disney was making Star Wars films, I don't think that they would have been as good as what George Lucas has made, or they definitely would have made everybody happy. I think that we certainly would still have griping and complaining, and this isn't the original Star Wars. I think that would have happened no matter what, but they would have been better. Disney was making great films during either of these golden ages, and it absolutely would have been wonderful to see a kind of Star Wars that they would have made. It would have been a little bit Disney-ified. It definitely would have been more for kids than Star Wars already is, but it would have been better. And I personally don't think there's an argument about that. If there is, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Let me know what you think. If an older Disney, a more golden age Disney had gotten a hold of Star Wars, what kind of movies you think they would have made, and would they have been good? So let me know in the comments.
And I've always had a fondness for Disney. And the match of what our two companies are is just perfect, because we're like a mini Disney.
The second point is the one that I really want to talk about today. And that's that if George Lucas kept it, would Star Wars have done better? Now, I think that the first thing to say right off the bat is yes, it would have done better. I think that the bar is so low from Disney, I don't really think there's a way around that. We obviously would have had better Star Wars if George Lucas had kept it. But I don't even think that the question really is whether or not it would have been better. I think that if anybody who doesn't buy into this sort of very partisan corporate culture of just putting movies out and TV shows out as fast as you can and make sure that you put the most partisan politics in there, instead of just telling objectively good stories, just getting out of that, they would have made a better Star Wars. They could have had a budget of $1 million. That would have been better than what we got. So in that regard, I think George Lucas definitely would have made a better Star Wars just because Disney's bar is so low. But would it have been really good? And to tell you the truth, I don't really know. One of the reasons why people hated the prequel trilogy so much is because of the inherent nature, I've talked about this before, is because of the inherent nature of growing up. When you grow up, a lot of the time you put things away without even knowing you're putting them away. Believe me, there was a time when you absolutely loved watching Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, or if you're my age, Care Bears or something like that. And you were very, very little, you could probably barely talk, and you absolutely loved watching these very little kid things. And then when you got a little bit older, you probably loved watching, something like, if you're my age, Transformers or G.I. Joe, or something like SpongeBob or Pokemon. So I think the inherent nature of growing up does create sort of a problem in this regard, where we do grow out of things. And the people that watched Star Wars back in 1977 through 1983, especially the ones that loved it, they were younger. Now, there were a lot of older people that loved it because it was just a cinematic marvel. It was an amazing thing to watch, but those people especially aged out. And you can say what you will about Revenge of the Sith being far more adult themed than anything Star Wars had made prior, and I agree with this, but episodes 1 and 2 are more for kids. They're more kid friendly than they are family friendly. In the original Star Wars movies, they are far more family friendly than they are kid friendly. They're for the whole family. And when the prequel trilogy came out, it was so heavily for kids that it turned a lot of people off. Now, I'm a Star Wars purist nerd. I have been since I was a little kid. It's the very first memory I have of my life is watching Return of the Jedi. So I love Star Wars, and it took me a while to really come around with Disney being so awful for Star Wars because I love it so much. But I do remember the arguments, and I had a lot of friends that were saying it was like Jar Jar doesn't belong in there. It's so bad it takes me right out of the experience. And I'd be like, it's not that bad, man. And you know what? Going back and looking at it, it kind of is. Jar Jar is kind of hard to watch. If you're like 28 to 35 and you're a Star Wars fan, you probably love the Clone Wars, right? You probably do, right? Now, I'm not saying that all of you do, but the majority of you probably do. And you probably, by polling data, right? This is by pulling data not just from my own channel, but from the largest Star Wars channel, Star Wars Theory, and from polling data from places like Rasmussen and other polling sites and other polls that came from news outlets. You probably like the prequel trilogy more than you do the original trilogy, which I also find very odd. So there is an aspect to aging out. And this is the part that I want to talk about here, because when it comes to George Lucas making a new Star Wars, first of all, we don't really know the direction he would have gone. Would it be even more for kids than it was before? I mean, he certainly did lean more into the it's for kids portion of Star Wars when he made the prequel trilogy. And if you watch the first 2 seasons of the Clone Wars, it's kind of like that there too, right? Where it's, yeah, sure, there's a war going on, but it's really kid heavy. And then right around season 3, things really start to shift and it starts to become far more adult themed, or at least teenager themed. And I think that's something, I'm not entirely sure how George Lucas would have handled that if he was making the sequel trilogy. I know some of the basics of what he wanted to talk about. It's going to be more about the wills of the Force. And I think all of that's very interesting. I'd love to have seen that, but I'm not entirely certain how it would have been received by the masses. And I do think that because of the way that Star Wars has gone over the last 10 years, and the way that people have reacted to Star Wars over the last 10 years, I'm not entirely certain that it would have done that well. I think that it would have been better than what we have, but I'm not entirely certain it would have done that well. And the reason why I say that is because if you were to take something like Rebels, for instance. Now, Rebels, in my opinion, Rebels is very similar to Clone Wars in that it started kind of for younger people, and then over time, it sort of developed into a far more adult-themed show, especially when Thrawn starts coming out. But the people that loved Clone Wars, by and large, there was a lot of people that really did not like it that were in that age range, this younger millennial type. And what's really interesting is there seems to be a lot of people that are more my age that had kids that were sort of younger. There's a lot of people that were, let's say, 10 years old, 5 years old, watching Rebels, didn't have a problem with it. If you were in your 20s when Rebels came out and you were a big Clone Wars fan, there's a really good chance you didn't like it at all. Now, don't be wrong, Rebels has kind of gained sort of more of a cult following over time, but it never had that kind of rabid fan base that the Clone Wars had. And that's what makes me think that even if George Lucas had kept Star Wars and he had made another series of movies, it really depends on how it is that he would have made it. If it was more family friendly, right, instead of being very kid friendly, then I think that he probably would have, nailed it. But bear something in mind, George Lucas has made a lot of amazing things. I mean, he really has. American Graffiti is one of my favorite movies ever. I love that movie. And he's very good at writing, and he's very good at storytelling, but he's not necessarily the best director. And we've seen that. We've seen that throughout the years. Some of the best Star Wars movies are not even directed by him. He seems to be better at the writing. He seems to be better at kind of directing how the story is supposed to go without being the director of a movie. So I'm not entirely certain that it would have been as great as everybody thinks that it would. I still want to see it. I would still love it if Lucasfilm just went back to George Lucas and then maybe we can see what it is that he can create. But as much as I love George Lucas Star Wars, I'm not entirely certain. Star Wars might be broken enough. It warrants years, decades off. I think that one of the benefits to Star Wars when it was owned by George Lucas is that we had such long breaks in between. Right now, with Disney coming out with stuff over and over and over again, I made a whole video about how I came to believe that there was such a thing as Star Wars fatigue. And I came to believe that this is a real thing, and I got a ton of backlash for that. People were telling me out of the woodwork, people that were watching my videos every single week were telling me, you're wrong, it's not, there's no such thing as Star Wars fatigue, it's because they're not making good stuff. Okay, Star Wars, part of Star Wars being epic is that it has years in between projects. And the only thing that you get your claws on to be able to kind of satiate you until the next, movie comes out, were like books and video games. But we didn't have something come out every single year. We definitely didn't have something, or it was like 2 or 3 things coming out every single year. That's too much. It gets in the way. So I think that George Lucas definitely would have benefited from that, because I don't think he would have made that many Star Wars movies. He expects the movies to be as good as he can make them. That's something that I always kind of cherish about that. He's going to sit there and he's going to meticulously plan out this thing before it comes out. And that is not the way that Disney does it at all. They throw money at it and hope something good comes out of it. And it just doesn't work that way. But anyway, I find it a very interesting conversation. What do you think? Do you think that if George Lucas kept Star Wars, not that it would have been better, because I think that that's an easy enough answer. You could just say, yes, it would be better. That's not what I'm looking for. Do you think that George Lucas's sequel trilogy would have been great? Do you think that it would have been well received by the masses? And I'm not so certain that I believe that it would. I'm not so certain that this particular culture right now of Star Wars fans would be okay with this at all. So anyway, that's what I've got for you today. I'd really love to hear your comments. I hope I've earned your subscription. Thanks for watching. God bless, and I'll see you next time.